talking to us about universal consciousness, and he does it from a scientific perspective. So here is finally someone who is attempting to merge the worlds instead of just saying, no, you, no, you, no. You know. So that's what I love, is we have someone who's going to merge here. So Alex, all yours. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about, I think, and not just me, but definitely, this is a big field. And what I want to say is I think it's probably one of the biggest changes in science that I see coming down the pike for a long while. So I'm going to be speaking to you on this topic from a scientific perspective. I think you'll see for yourself that it relates to Christianity, and I'll kind of try to show you the connection as we go on. So I've been studying this topic, consciousness, for a while. How it is that we create our visual conscious experience. How it is that our neurons, as they become active, will somehow create the sensation of the color blue or the color red, right? It's like, that's a big mystery. And people have been wondering about this since the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, right? For 2,000, 3,000 years, people have been wondering how our conscious experience is produced. And it isn't until basically the last 30 years that we've made some scientific progress. Before that, there was a lot of hesitation to study consciousness, and some of that had to do with this gentleman here who came up, as you know, I think therefore I am, but he came up with this idea that the world of mind and spirit was separate from the world of the material, right? And so that was a very handy perspective for the time, because it allowed the church to do its work over here and scientists do their work over here, and they didn't have to necessarily talk to each other. The problem with that, though, is that it made the study of consciousness and, anything related to the inner self off limits to science for a long time. And this is part of the reason that we've made what appears to be little progress in studying conscious experience. The other thing that I'm amazed at is this, that we haven't, even after deciding to study this, we haven't made more progress. So back in the 90s, I talked to my postdoc advisor and said I was interested in this topic, and he told me, don't bother, it's not really a science. And I said, I was thinking to myself, why? We're talking about the brain functioning neurons, inside each other. That's a biological system. Why should we not study that? What's the hesitation, right? There seemed to be a pretty strong hesitation. And I believe that besides this barrier that I just mentioned, there is another barrier, and that's this, that I think that there's a kind of an intuitive understanding on some level that understanding consciousness is going to change science as we know it. Okay, so that's how big this is. This is a societal transformational concept, and it's coming down the road. And the reason that I think it hasn't probably made more progress in getting out into the ears of the public is because people are hesitant to talk about it, because it requires us to change the way we think about ourselves, the way that we relate to each other, the way that we relate to society, to nature, right? So it's a whole different perspective. So let me talk to you a little bit about what we've learned. So in the last 30 years, we've figured out a lot about how the brain is involved in producing the conscious experience, in that there are people that have had damage to their brain, strokes, accidents, etc., that have lost abilities to do things that we take for granted. So I'm showing you here an image of St. Paul's in London that was drawn by a person who had visual agnosia. And what they did is they looked at a picture and they drew this exactly as what they were seeing, right? And then they were asked, after they were done, what did you just draw? And they had no idea. It's like, I don't know. So this goes to show that there are parts of our brain that are putting all the pieces together. And if you damage that part of the brain, then you can't put the pieces together. You can see the lines, you can see the corners, right? You can see the angles, right? You can see maybe a little square here, but you can't put it all together in your mind. So this goes to show that there are centers in our brain that are responsible for pulling it all together. This is another form of syndrome, problem that people have. When you have damage to your brain, you can lose the ability to see motion. So there's a center in our brain that's involved for seeing motion, and people that have kinetopsia see the world as stills. So they'll see somebody moving like this, and then a few seconds later they'll see another image like this, and then maybe, so everything is just still shots. And that can be very disconcerting, because you can imagine being on a street, looking up the street and seeing a car coming at you, right? It's at a distance, you start to take a step out, then it's really close in your next image, right? It can be very upsetting. So this again shows that there's a center that's involved in seeing motion. Here, this is chromatopsia, again, stroke victims, people that have had accidents, lose the ability to see color, everything becomes a black and white movie. And they can see perfectly, right? They can see everything, but it's black and white, and it's so, this is such a large change that they can't even remember color. Like if you ask them, can you explain red to me? They can't do it. They don't remember what it was like. So clearly, from these kinds of studies, right, that have been done over the last 50 years or so, the brain's involved, right? The brain is doing something in creating consciousness. So the perspective that we've taken is, well, the brain is creating consciousness, right? It's the activity of the neurons is creating consciousness, and this is how we can see, this is how we can smell, this is how we can taste, right? It's our visual experience. So one thing that I want to make sure to impress upon you is that even though we can talk about these all separately, this is where we kind of live, right? A lot of our life. We're living, seeing, smelling, tasting, right? This is kind of our daily living experience, right? A lot of it that I'm talking about. All right, so what I want to do is I want to quickly talk about a couple of ideas that have come out from this work. One is the global workspace, which is this idea that all the parts of the brain are involved in creating your conscious experience. So for the longest time, people thought it was all up here in the front, and it's become clear that the whole brain has to participate in creating the conscious experience, and these different parts of our brain are talking to each other as you become conscious, right, as you have a conscious experience. So this was an important kind of insight because, like I said, it shows the whole brain's necessary to have the human experience that we have, right, with all the pieces of vision and hearing and tasting and all the other things that we experience. This is another little piece to the puzzle that's come up in the last few years. There's a way of thinking about the flow of information from the eyes to the back of the brain and then forward in the brain. That's called the feed-forward sweep. What we've realized is that that flow of information is unconscious, and it only becomes conscious when the higher centers, the later centers, talk back to the earlier centers. When they start to talk back, that's when you start having a conscious experience. And you can interrupt that, like with electromagnetic fields. You can flash an electromagnetic field on the visual part of the brain, and you won't be able to see something that was just presented to you. So you can interrupt the conscious experience by disturbing the talk-back process. So that's another piece of the puzzle that we've been able to figure out. So we've made some great progress in figuring out certain pieces of the puzzle. Here's another one, temporal synchrony. This is the idea that the parts of the brain that are contributing to your conscious experience are all becoming active in synchrony with each other. Think of them flashing on and off, flashing on and off. They're in synchrony, they're not doing this, right? They're going like this. All in synchrony together. Okay, good. So this is a lot of information, but it doesn't tell us how the conscious experience is produced. It tells us phenomena that are associated with the conscious experience, right? Temporal synchrony, global workspace. It doesn't tell us how neurons exciting each other creates a conscious experience. So, I'm going to jump past this right now, and I'm going to go ahead and show you a quick little video, so bear with me here. Oh, sorry about that.
Why does it feel like something to see a Picasso painting, hear a Mahler symphony, smell fresh drawing? What seems to be the most obvious thing on Earth may be in fact the most mysterious thing in the universe. It's called consciousness, and throughout my life I've been obsessed by it. Obsessed because every explanation seems bizarre. Obsessed because consciousness is the ultimate test whether there is anything apart from the physical world. In 1994, when I first heard about the Tucson Conference, Toward a Science of Consciousness, with most leading thinkers attending, I wanted to attend. Over the years, there was always a reason why I did not. In 2014, the conference's 20th anniversary, I finally did. I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to Tucson and toward a science of consciousness. I'm invited by one of the founders of the Tucson Conference, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist and passionate pioneer of consciousness studies. I've known Stuart since 2003, when he appeared in a Closer to Truth episode on consciousness. I'm thrilled to be here in Tucson. I see many old friends. Sue Blackmore, Dave Chalmers, Deepak Chopra, Dan Dennett, Rebecca Goldstein, John Sterling. All superstars of consciousness, all participants on Closer to Truth. Have their views changed? Do they have new ideas? I searched for Stuart to get the history of the conference. I find him in the exhibition hall, amidst a blizzard of kaleidoscopic ideas on consciousness, from the hyper-scientific to the weirdly spiritual. Not to be a killjoy, Stu, but none of this explains consciousness or moves me much, though I love the passion.
Stuart, 20 years, the conference a great success, to your credit. As you look upon these 20 years, the development of the conference, but also its impact on how literally the whole world looks at consciousness, how do you reflect on it?
20 years ago, the study of consciousness in the scientific framework was just beginning to come out of the shadows of behaviorism, which had dominated psychology and neuroscience for most of the 20th century. People like Roger Penrose, Francis Crick, Gerald Edelman wrote books in the 1980s that began to make it somewhat respectable, but there hadn't been any interdisciplinary conferences. There have been conferences in philosophy, in Eastern spirituality, some in neuroscience, but nobody really brought all these together. So we tried to do that in the 1994 conference under one umbrella, under one tent. The first conference, the first day was philosophy, and we had two well-known philosophers speak first. They read their talks, and the interdisciplinary audience grew very restless and bored. Fortunately, the third talk was by an unknown philosopher named David Chalmers, who jumped up on stage and started strutting and prancing like Mick Jagger, talking about the hard problem. And the easy problems were memory, attention, behavior, reportability, and so forth. And those were very difficult. But the hard problem was a whole other ballgame. And he made that point clear. Everybody kind of got it at that moment. At the coffee break, people go, oh, the hard problem, that's why we're here. At that moment, I think the movement galvanized and kind of brought everybody together.
I first interviewed Dave Chalmers in 1999, then again in 2007. He has cut his long hair, I hardly recognize him. Dave has become an acclaimed philosopher, tackling many issues, but consciousness remains his core.
30 years ago, there really wasn't a science of consciousness or even much of a philosophy of consciousness to speak of. Not many people were working on it. It's just mushroomed over the last 10, 20 years. Some of the mushrooming has been in the science. There's now an incredibly active neuroscience of consciousness, for example. People are working on the neural correlates of consciousness, brain areas specifically that go along with different kinds of conscious states. 30 years ago, I don't think you could get tenure working on the neural basis of consciousness. Now there's actually a respectable research program.
How do you account for that?
I think it's because people actually found good experimental paradigms for working on it. They do things like studying binocular rivalry, send different signals to one eye, see what people report being conscious of, and then measure the neurons in the brain that go along with what they report being conscious of, and it turns out you can do science. I see the science as kind of the integration of objective data about the brain and about behavior, looking at the system from the third person point of view, with subjective data, what we experience from the inside, that is consciousness. And then we report that, and we say what we're experiencing from the inside, that's first person data. So you put together the first person data about consciousness with the third person data about the brain and behavior, and it turns out you can do some science.
In principle, is it possible for neuroscience to explain the heart problem? In principle.
What I would say is, on its own, no. That is, if you want a complete explanation of consciousness in terms of processes in the brain, and that's all, no. Processes in the brain will explain things like the functioning of brain systems, the behaviors we produce, but when it comes to consciousness, those are the easy problems. The hard problem is the problem about subjective experience. It looks like just telling the structural, dynamical story about the brain always leaves open a gap. Why is all that accompanied by experience? Why doesn't it go on in the dark? So my view is you've got to supplement neuroscience by something like further fundamental principles connecting the brain processes to consciousness, and find that fundamental theory of consciousness. Well, your progress in philosophy...
Dave has come a long way from when we first met on Question of Truth. A roundtable discussion, a debate actually, with John Searle. John's here too, and I can't wait to see him get his take on progress, or lack of it, in getting at consciousness. John is a distinguished philosopher of mind, language, and war. He's one of my heroes. He has appeared on Closer to Truth more than a dozen times. John, you've been thinking about consciousness for more than half a century. You and I have been talking about consciousness for 15 years. Has any progress been made?
Well, certainly not. A lot of progress in these issues is negative. Certain obvious mistakes, I think, are less and less likely to be made. So, for example, when we first started talking about this, the standard view was consciousness, well, that's a computer program running in your brain. Now, I've been attacking that view for 30 years, and I don't know if these attacks have any effect, but I hear that less. Now I think people are more likely to respect the brain as an actual biological organ and to think of consciousness as a biological phenomenon. So that is a kind of progress, that certain sorts of mistakes get avoided. Behaviorism is another one. You used to hear, well, there's any such thing as consciousness, it's just behavior. And that's all we can do is investigate behavior, but you don't hear that much anymore. However, that's the good news. The bad news is we don't seem to be making an awful lot of progress on figuring out how exactly does the brain do it? How exactly does the brain produce consciousness? And partly that has to do with the fact that the brain is an extremely complicated mechanism. You got 100 billion neurons and God knows how many zillion synapses, and we really don't yet know what specific brain processes are responsible for consciousness. However, we're getting closer.
Are we getting closer to explaining consciousness? There's sure a proliferation of competing explanations. I should survey the landscape. I asked Stuart Hammeroff for a tour. Stuart, lay out for me the spectrum of thinking on consciousness, because the conference itself really mirrors the richness of the diversity of ideas about consciousness.
It kind of starts with how you look at where consciousness is in the universe. Most views in modern science would say that consciousness emerged as a product of evolution, some kind of adaptive process related to information processing in nervous systems, for example. On the other hand, you have people like Deepak Chopra, Eastern spiritualists and idealists, who would say consciousness has been in the universe all along. It's built into the universe and everything in between. So that translates, on the one hand, to the most, I would say, conservative view that of eliminative materialism that would deny the hard problem that consciousness is essentially equivalent to computation in the brain among neurons. And then you move a little bit towards materialism, again, emerging from complex interactions among particles of matter, for example, neurons firing in the brain. And then there's a bunch of views having to do with how it's organized in the brain, They combine philosophical approaches like higher order thought theory, access versus phenomenal, conscious versus non-conscious, global workspace, which is kind of the theater metaphor of where it occurs in the brain, and then our view of going to a deeper level inside neurons, a deeper order, finer scale processes within the neuron, increasing the capacity of information, but also reaching the quantum level where if you reduce further than reductions normally do, you get to the quantum level and you get non-locality, things spread out. So, in our view, reductions don't reduce far enough. Moving along the spectrum, I'd say you have integrated information theory that is less based on the neuronal structure than we are, and then idealism.
Actually, before that, I would put the traditional dualism, which is believed by probably most people, at least in the religious world, and not necessarily the scientific or philosophical world, that there's two separate real entities, a physical and a spiritual or soulish kind of.
Right, go back to Descartes.
Yeah.
We're in the middle. We believe that consciousness in some form has been in the universe all along, at least as part of conscious events, and the brain evolved mechanisms to access and connect to it at a deeper level.
Such divergence, nowhere else in science do possible explanations differ so dramatically. The size range for locating the seat of consciousness is staggeringly large. From subatomic quantum physics, to sweeping reverberating brain pathways, to cosmic consciousness encompassing everything. A radical account, gathering adherents and gaining strength, confirms how deep, how intractable the problem of consciousness really is. Dave Chalmers is one of its champions, and he is here in Tucson as if a kind of missionary.
Perhaps the most interesting development in philosophy in the last few years has been the really serious development of what people call panpsychist approaches to consciousness. A little bit of consciousness everywhere. Consciousness is present at the ground level in physics. Even a photon has a little bit of consciousness. Okay, that sounds a little bit crazy, but it turns out to be one way to get consciousness inside that natural order of the physical world, playing in a causal role without somehow failing outside it as something totally different. Here's my theory of the hard problem. You're not going to solve it without at least one crazy idea. Maybe two, maybe three. And different people have different crazy ideas. My friend Dan, he's got a crazy idea. His is, there is no hard problem. Maybe there's not even this distinctive datum of consciousness to explain. That requires going way out on a limb in one direction. On the other side, take consciousness as fundamental, that's going out on a limb in another direction. It turns out that once you do this, then you can make progress.
Okay, so there's a lot of opinions here, right, that we're looking at. I want you to I want to pass this out as a handout, and maybe you might need to share, just because I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but you, and there you go. Is that two or is that one? I wonder if that's two. I'm sorry, is that two? All right. Here you go. All right, so this is a letter that was recently written by 150 neuroscientists, and what they're doing is saying that the biggest, most prominent theory of consciousness out there, which is called IIT, Integrated Information Theory. It's been around for about 20 years or so. There are millions of dollars in grants that are being given to people that are studying this, and basically it's the idea that information itself is somehow consciousness. They're saying that they don't believe it, that it's not true. Basically, this is the main idea of consciousness right now, and they're saying they don't believe it, and I agree with them. I don't think it's valid, this idea, IIT. The reason I say that is because I'm looking at it from a biological perspective, and there's nothing about their theory that I think really addresses a lot of the biological issues that other neuroscientists are looking at. So I'm giving you this so that you can realize that there's no theory right now. After 30 years of studying this, there is no theory to explain consciousness. And the other thing that I want to add to that is, we're talking about a bunch of brilliant people. I'm not including myself in that number, but Nobel laureates, like they mentioned some of them. Francis Crick, the person who discovered DNA, decided he was going to jump into this. There are Nobel laureate physicists that are studying this. other Nobel laureates, biologists that are studying this, they're brilliant people, right? Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, and they haven't made any progress in 30 years. Okay, so this is important for us to focus on because this happens in science. Let me see. Let me get my PowerPoint back up here. Let me get this started again. And let me make sure that's working. Okay, so that's what I was just talking about. So this does happen in science, but it happens when there is an assumption, a basic assumption that's incorrect. And let me give you an example. There was an idea about the universe that existed for almost 2,000 years that was being taught by all the great thinkers, and that was this geocentric model of the universe. That the universe had the Earth at the center, and around the Earth there were these shells of stars and planets, and it all rotated around the Earth. Right? That persisted for almost 2,000 years, and the problem was this, that no matter how hard people tried to make that theory work, there was always something that didn't match, it didn't fit, right? Like planets were going backwards, and it's like, why, they could not make that theory, and they tried so hard for 2,000 years, right? Bless their hearts, right? They tried and they tried and they tried. It wasn't until Copernicus wrote his book, which he published posthumously because he was afraid of getting a lot of heat for this, right? He published his book back in the 1500s and said, no, the sun's at the center, right? And he gave his explanations, and when you looked at the universe from that perspective, it all fell into place. All the pieces that were not making sense, it all completely makes sense, right? So basically the idea is this, that there wasn't any more research that was required. No other studies or mathematical principles had to be made. The thing that had to change was the perspective, right? The assumptions that were being made. The assumption was, we're at the center. No, the sun's at the center, and when you do that, it works. And there's a part of me, a little bit of a cynical part of me that thinks that in part was supported by the fact that we humans are a little bit egocentric. So we want to be at the center of everything, right?
Yeah.
And I think that this is part of the reason why the shift in understanding consciousness hasn't happened, because we say consciousness is in here, right? It's in here, it's us, but maybe not. Maybe the focus needs to be outside of us, in the same way the focus needs to be outside of the earth, somewhere else, right? Okay, so this is important for us to get. So the reason that I showed you that video is I wanted you to kind of understand that this is something that is big. Lots of people have been studying it. People that are very advanced in their knowledge of all of this have all been studying this, and we haven't made any progress. There are some ideas that are coming out from this, and that is, well, maybe consciousness isn't created by the brain. Maybe the brain manipulates consciousness that's already there. And let me give you a biological perspective on this. Biological systems don't invent things. They take advantage of what already exists in nature, like, for example, chemistry, right? Biology uses chemistry to run our metabolism. Diffusion, that's another kind of physical principle. Things kind of migrate through space down their concentration gradients. Well, we use that in our bodies to get oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our bodies. Diffusion, right? So all of these basic chemistry and physical principles of the universe are utilized by biological systems. They didn't invent them, right? Those things existed long before anything was alive. They existed. So is it possible that biological systems have figured out how to use something that's already in nature? Right? Consciousness, a subtle form of consciousness, maybe exists in nature already, and biological systems have just figured out how to manipulate it and use it so that, from a biological perspective, to enhance success, right? Reproductive success and living, right? Life. So I talked to a bunch of Buddhist monks about this idea because I was part of the Emory Tibet Science Initiative for 10 years. We were sending neuroscientists, biologists, and physicists to southern India to teach Buddhist monks, Tibetan Buddhist monks, these fields, right? And so we had a lot of interchange taking place. And on my last visit, we had a chance to talk about this idea of consciousness, and I shared with them these ideas that I've been talking to you about today. And as I was going through and talking about this, there were a couple of geisha monks, which is basically their Ph.D. level education, and they were looking at me and they were smiling, and I was thinking, these guys think I'm a nut, right? Because they're smiling. And so finally at the end, when I finished, I said, I noticed from smiling, what's your perspective on this? And they said, this idea of a subtle form of consciousness is something that we've known for a long time in our system. We know about subtle consciousness because through our meditative techniques and through using the mind, we can connect with this subtle form of consciousness that exists in the universe. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing, right? It's like, oh wow, I guess maybe, there's another way of looking at this and studying this, right? So, this is a big concept. And you can see that people are starting to write about it, right? So, NBC, NPR, Scientific American, right? It's getting out there. It's the idea that maybe it's not our brain that's creating consciousness. Maybe consciousness is part of the universe and we're just using a little bit of it to create our conscious experiences, right? That leads to some big questions like, what does that mean? That maybe consciousness exists throughout the universe. It's like, well, is that tree conscious, right? Is that plant conscious? Does it have some minimal amount of consciousness? You could look at this table and say, that table's not conscious, right? The theory that I'm proposing is, let me just back up a second, is that consciousness is embedded in electromagnetic fields, and I'm not the only one who's saying this. There are other people that are talking about this. And electromagnetic fields they have wave mechanical processes. And if you've studied physics, you know that when waves come together, or if you've just been at the beach, how about that? You know that when a crest meets a trough, it cancels each other out. So what I propose in this theory is that the amount of consciousness that's in this table is very, very small because the waves are interfering with each other in a destructive way. That's the physical terminology. And so that creates a very minimal amount of consciousness that isn't noticeable. But our brains have these neural circuits that are able to do the opposite. They get these waves to add up and create very large kind of manifestations. You could say have a great amplitude. These waves have a great amplitude. And then we have this conscious experience, and I believe it happens a lot like the Seurat painting here, which he pointillist, right? A lot of little points of color. I think that there are little bits of simple forms of consciousness like visual consciousness, red, blue, green, that are produced by these circuits and that they all come together into the large kind of experience that we have. If you need another example, think about a computer screen with all the pixels, right? All these little tiny pixels, they're all individual little pixels, but when you step back, you see one scene. So that's the idea. I believe that that's the way that our conscious experience is created. Again, it doesn't explain how consciousness is produced in the first place. It just talks about how these little circuits are creating these little bits that somehow come together. I think these little circuits are like sculptors. They take clay that's out there, they form it into a specific instance, a certain type of shape, right? And then those little shapes come together to create the overall experience that we have. Okay, so that's just my perspective. This is my 2 cents that I'm adding to this conversation. The bigger question is consciousness found all around us? And I think that to accept that, we're going to have to change our mentality in a very big way, because then nature is aware, right? Everything is aware, and not only that, we can almost think of ourselves as being embedded in a larger aware field or conscious field, right? It's not like we're separate. Our consciousness isn't separate from this larger consciousness. It's part of the same consciousness that pervades the entire universe, right? It's a whole other way of thinking about ourselves. So what does it mean that we're part of a larger conscious field? Well, for one, it means that we're not separate from each other. We think we are, but maybe we're really not, right? Maybe we're connected in more intimate ways than we ever suspected. Now, there are some traditions, religious traditions that kind of go out some of these concepts. I think that this is a real part of the universe that is going to revolutionize science, because everything changes, right? Everything, the way we study and think about everything, material objects, everything changes. We're going to study, hopefully we'll get to the point soon where we'll be able to start studying this out in nature and realize that, let me go forward, that we're not, that this consciousness that we're talking about is not separate. So one way to think about this is that consciousness is distributed throughout nature and everything's a little bit conscious, but then so what? Well, I don't believe that's true. I think that this consciousness that is all out there is connected, that there's like a connection between all of it. And if that is true, then we're talking about something so massive that we can barely think, we can barely take it in, right? Because we're talking about the entire universe's consciousness, right, as one thing. Now, if you step back, you could say, well, something like that would be omniscient. Something like that would be omnipresent, right? Something like that might be omnipotent. Can you see how these terms would apply? So if we're talking about a consciousness that encompasses the entire universe, we're talking about something so massive and so great that it's hard for us to imagine. And what I'm saying to you is maybe we're connected to all that, right? Maybe we're not separate from that. Now, I have a lot to talk about that connection, and I'm going to wait to talk about that next week, because I've worked through some ideas about how all this could be connected and how it all could come together. That I'm going to wait, because that's a whole other can of worms, and it's a lot of information to try to process all at one time. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions on this topic. Yes?
The universal consciousness, what do we do with our propensity as human beings in our own consciousness to ethnomorphize everything as applying to me? For instance, the worm might have more consciousness than I do, but in its own realm.
Right.
What is that something we need to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like where we're coming from, right? Mm-hmm. I believe that we're kind of moving toward, so let me become a Christian again instead of a scientist. I believe we're moving toward God, right? Societies are moving toward God. That's kind of what God wants, right? Creating heaven on earth, right? So I think we're moving toward it. It's a slow and ugly process, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think that we are slowly moving toward it. I think that recognizing that maybe we're all part of this conscious field that I'm talking about, that's a different way of thinking about it, is part of it. That's kind of a cold and dry way of thinking about it, though, because God's love, right? So I haven't really talked about that, and I'm going to talk about that more next week. But I believe that we are going to get to that point, and it's not going to be easy. It hasn't been, right? It hasn't been, but we will get to that point. I think that's God's plan, right? Is that we're going to get there, and I'm not going to argue with God. I believe we are going to get there. It's just going to be messy, and it is messy, right? I think that these kinds of conversations of thinking about how we're connected, right? So one of the problems we're having now is that we're so focused on the material world now, in everything, right? In popular media, and even science, right? Even science up to this point has been material world, material world, material world. And that's a problem. I think maybe science is contributing to the problem. The science is currently structured because everybody believes in the science of medicine and science, all these good things that are coming out of science, and so they think, well, science is telling us there's only the material world. That's a mistake, right? That's a mistake. So this is part of the problem right now, is we're so focused on the material world. Well, if the material world's the only thing, then I'm separate from you, right? And I have to look out for my own needs.
What do we do with the need, according to the scientific method, to quantize?
I think what it is that I think we just have to get a new perspective, right? And I think that if science can move in this direction and start explaining it, right? Maybe we're not connected. Maybe there's a real, maybe we are connected. There's a real connection between everybody and nature, right? So that's another problem is we separate ourselves from nature and look at what's happened, right? So by really understanding and maybe growing up with these ideas, right? Teaching it to young people, we're not disconnected from everything. We're actually connected to everything and to each other. That will help, right? That's one piece of this larger story that I think God's a path, right? That God's moving us down. I think that's just one piece of it, right? I think people just need to learn about this, right? They need to hear about it. A lot of people don't know anything about this, right? They don't know about this concept that we could be connected. A lot of people would laugh at the idea, right, that we might be connected. So I think that one of the great aspects about talking about this from a scientific perspective is that a lot of people buy into science, and it has a certain punch to it, right? So if you can get scientists to start saying, we're connected, we can look at consciousness and, it leads us to this idea, right? If you can, start talking to the population in general, then I think it's going to have an effect, right? Just like, you could have people talking about cancer treatments, right? If you do this, it's going to help you. Well, people are going to buy it. Yes, they'll try it, right? That's what science is saying. I think that it has value from that perspective. Yeah, yes?
No, I think I can project loud enough.
Okay.
Can I ask you just to clarify something? Did you say that not maybe you, but that the thinking is that maybe consciousness came from the strong force? Did I hear that correctly?
No.
What did you say? Electromagnet? The electromagnetic?
Right. What I believe is that it's embedded in electromagnetism, maybe in photons themselves. So just to explain, an electromagnetic field is a field around, let's say, a point charge. That field is basically photons, right? So the electromagnetic force is carried by photons. So really we're talking about photons, and basically that's what I'm saying. So photons are light, right? Photons are light.
Does electromagnetism come from the strong force?
No, it's its own force. It's its own thing. Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
Sure. Now, I believe that at least, thank you so much for that. I think it's at least the electromagnetic fields. It might be more. I'm not sure. So this is getting into the field of quantum field, right?
Yeah, that's where I was trying to
So
go.
one thing that's related to this from quantum mechanics and the quantum field is this idea of entanglement. Have you heard of this, entanglement? Entanglement is this idea that if these two particles become physically entangled, you can separate them, and at a distance, one can know what the other is doing, right? And it's faster than light communication. So that's related to what I'm talking about, and like I said, I'll expand on that next week because it'll take a while to get through it. I'm going to show you some other video and images that I think are going to be helpful to talk about that. But we're going to be talking about special relativity, Einstein's theory of special relativity, and I'm going to try to make it as understandable as possible. We're going to talk about Richard Feynman's ideas about sum over paths. This has to do with something called quantum electrodynamics. Again, I'm going to make it as easy as possible to understand. Show you some images. And I believe that these two thinkers, Einstein and Feynman was as brilliant as Einstein. If you've ever read any of his work, he was brilliant. These two thinkers walked us down, part of the way down the road to understanding what we're talking about here. They didn't go all the way because maybe they were just products of their time, right? Einstein in the early part of the 20th century, Feynman more in the middle part of the 20th century, but they only could go so far. But I think we're ready to take that next step. So I'm going to take their work and kind of just keep on going down the road to show you where it leads. Okay? And I think it's about this connection that we're talking about. Any other questions? All right, so what I've talked about is something that's big. It's hard to take in. I would like, if you could, over the next week, just take a few minutes a few minutes throughout the week, let's say, and just ask yourself, what would it mean if everything was conscious? Everything had consciousness associated with it. What would it mean to me, right, if everything was conscious? And how does that tie into what I know about the universe through Christianity? Right? How does it tie into that? Because I don't think we're talking about separate things. I think we're talking about the same thing. Okay. All right, I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I can't help myself. I can't help myself. Wait a minute. Yeah, maybe I can. With Virginia's help. I am very, very interested in this topic, as Alex knows. I am interested in, and I have not run this by Mother Angela, nor have I run it by my co-chair, but I am interested in doing more adult formation classes like this where we can discuss these kinds of concepts, because I believe they are so important. I believe each one of us influences everyone and everything else just by who we are. I just believe that, and so it's super important to become aware of that so we can do good in the world and, not evil.
Yeah, that kind of separation that we feel we have. Right?
Yeah, we're not separate, but we need to be mindful of that and be good stewards. So anyway, and maybe Alex and I can do some things together or something. So thank you for